for signing in to my webinar. Hopefully everybody has been staying safe and healthy in the midst of everything that's been going on. I know our group has been working from home since the middle of March, and we're just slowly starting to get some approvals to get back onto campus. So hopefully we'll start to get into the office here soon. But anyways, my name is Taryn. I'm a research dietitian here at Ohio State, currently working from home. And I've been working in Dr. Jeff Volek's research lab for the past 5 years, where we primarily focus on the application of the ketogenic diet and a variety of health conditions, ranging from individuals that are healthy to individuals with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. And so today I'll be chatting with you about both keto and low carbohydrate approaches to eating and living, kind of how the two vary, what exactly they look like, how you can potentially implement them, and why we're interested in carbohydrate restriction in the first place. And feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation. I'll try to keep an eye on that chat box, and if it's pertinent, I can try to answer the questions as I'm going as well. And so just before we dive into the nutrition side of things, I wanted to give you all a current snapshot of what the state of prediabetes and diabetes is within the United States. Because recently, just in 2019, the American Diabetes Association, also known as the ADA, came out with a consensus statement stating that low carbohydrate and very low carbohydrate diets can be utilized as a management tool for individuals with diabetes and prediabetes, which was a big win for groups like ours, because historically the ADA has really only advocated for high carbohydrate and low carbohydrate diets for people with prediabetes and diabetes. So it's great that they are starting to follow the research that's coming out in terms of keto and low carb and its benefits for individuals with diabetes. And so currently, according to the CDC, 34.2 million Americans have diabetes. So that's approximately 1 in every 10 individuals, or about 10% of the population. And so this does encompass both type 1 and type 2 diabetes. However, type 2 diabetes accounts for about 90 to 95% of that number. And in most cases, type 2 diabetes can be prevented with different lifestyle interventions, such as nutrition and exercise. And then 88 million Americans have prediabetes. So it's approximately 1 in every 3 individuals, or about 34% of the population. So it's a pretty significant chunk of us here in America that are facing prediabetes and diabetes and having to deal with the side effects of this disease. And not only are individuals experiencing just, the high glucose and the high insulin and things of that nature, but there's also a financial burden that's associated with diabetes as well. It's been shown that individuals that have diabetes are spending more than twice as much on their medical costs compared to individuals without diabetes. So it's definitely important that these nutrition interventions kind of come to the forefront and are provided to these individuals so they can decide how they want to manage their disease. And so it's pretty evident that keto is an interest for a lot of individuals, or they're at least curious about it. So in 2019, what is keto was the second most Googled health-related question, just under how to lower blood pressure, which keto can also help with. And actually in 2018, what is keto was the #1 most Googled health-related question. So there's definitely a lot of interest around this topic and really just low carbohydrate approaches to eating in general, which is really great and exciting. But kind of along with that, there's a lot of people out there that are trying to make money off of this topic. There's a lot of diet books out there, a lot of bloggers, also a lot of misinformation on the internet. So it can make it kind of confusing as to what exactly this approach is and if it's safe and if it's healthy. And a lot of people they want to know more about it, and they kind of feel like it's a fad diet, and it really isn't. And in fact, it's been around for decades, if not centuries. And so I've got just kind of a brief history of low carb and keto here for you. just a couple pinpoints on the timeline. It's definitely not all encompassing by any means. But back in the 1860s, William Banting wrote what's called the Letter of Corpulence. And so he had been an individual that was struggling with his weight for a really long time. And his physician recommended that he essentially cut carbs from his diet. And so he tried out a low carbohydrate diet, and he was able to write this letter. And then throughout the 1920s, keto has been used as, or had been used as, a nutrition therapy for children with epilepsy. And kind of once medications started to be developed for epilepsy, that tended to be the choice of treatment. However, there is a clinic and at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore that's been utilizing keto as a nutrition therapy for the last 100 years for both adults and children in terms of treating their seizures. And then in 1921, before insulin was actually developed in 1921, before then, carbohydrate restriction was really the only tool that individuals with type 2 diabetes could use to help kind of manage their disease as best they could. But of course, insulin has been essential in terms of prolonging their life. And then in 1972, there's the Atkins diet revolution, and paleo kind of came on board in 2002, just a lot of those primal kind of low carb diets in general. And then throughout the 2000s, there's been a whole resurgence in ketogenic related research. So from 1980 to 2000, there had only really been about 215 articles published about the ketogenic diet or keto in general. And since 2000 until today, really, there's been well over 2,000 publications related on this topic of the ketogenic diet and nutritional ketosis. So definitely an increased awareness around this topic, and a lot of researchers kind of diving into it. And so today both low carb and keto are very popular. And for good reason, because these carbohydrate restriction in general has been shown to help control blood sugar and blood glucose. And there's 3 carbohydrates that make up the majority of foods or all the foods that we eat. So that's carb, protein, and fat. And these carbohydrates have different functions within the body. And they also have result in different responses in your blood sugar when you're consuming them. So carbohydrates are really important in terms of providing energy for the body, and as well as energy storage. And when consumed, it also results in the highest increase in your blood sugar when compared to protein and fats. And then protein is really important for tissue repair and maintenance, regulating body processes, nutrient transport and storage, as well as immune health. And it results in about a moderate increase in your blood sugar. And then last but not least, we've got fat. Fat is also really important for energy, also nutrient absorption, as well as regulating body temperature and just kind of protecting those internal organs in general. And fat has little to no impact on your blood sugar. So if somebody has been struggling with keeping their fasting blood glucose below 100 milligrams per deciliter, or keeping their A1C, which is your average blood sugar, blood glucose over the span of 3 months, below 5.7%, maybe kind of manipulating your macronutrient intake can be something that can help you have better glycemic control. So lowering those carbohydrates a little bit and having fat replace those calories could be an option. And so let's kind of get into the basics of what exactly a ketogenic approach looks like. And I'm going to use approach and nutrition pattern as opposed to diet, because I feel like the word diet is synonymous with something that is temporary and short term. And really, we want to focus on helping individuals find an approach or a pattern that can be sustainable for a long period of time. And so it's more of like a lifestyle, not something that's so short term. It can be something that's a little bit more permanent. And so Ketogenic in general is a low carbohydrate, adequate protein, and high fat approach to eating. And really the goal here is to be in a state of nutritional ketosis, which I'll chat about a little bit later. And so in general, to be in a state of nutritional ketosis, you do have to limit your carbohydrates to about 30 to 50 grams per day. And so this does mean that you're not really consuming any sort of obvious carbs. So think things like bread, pasta, high glycemic fruits like apples and bananas, starchy vegetables or just starchy foods in general like sweet potatoes, whole grains, corn, things of that nature. And so half of a bagel is about 20 grams of carbohydrate. And so if you eat that whole bagel, it's 40 grams of carb. And basically with just that one food item, you're at essentially your allotment of carbohydrate for the day. So that's really why you have to keep those foods limited. However, the carbs, the small amount of carbs that you are consuming are going to be coming from non-starchy vegetables. So you really want to focus on a variety of those. So leafy greens, cauliflower, broccoli, colorful peppers, as well as low glycemic fruits like berries, avocado, tomato, and then nuts and seeds. And so while you're not getting a lot of carbohydrates from these foods, you are getting a lot of nutrient density from these foods, which is really important when you're following a well-formulated ketogenic approach to eating. And then in terms of protein, I feel like there's that misconception out there that this is a high protein approach to eating, and it's not. In fact, eating too much protein can actually prevent you from being in nutritional ketosis. So it is important that you're not over consuming protein. So it's not low protein, it's not high protein, it's moderate or adequate. So kind of that Goldilocks amount, you could say. And so for most individuals, this is somewhere between 1.2 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of reference body weight or your ideal body weight. So it's really just kind of dependent on your height, your stature. And it generally equates to be about 80 to 110 grams of protein a day. And then once you've figured out your carbohydrate intake and your protein intake, the remainder of your calories are going to be coming from fat. So it's important that you're not afraid of fat and that you don't avoid it and that it is a component at every meal, because that's what's going to ensure that you're getting enough calories, you are feeling satiated, and that you are fueled well throughout the day. And I've got this little pie chart here, which kind of shows the percentage breakdown of what those macronutrients will look like in terms of percentages. And this will vary person to person based on whether or not you are maintaining your weight or you're wanting to lose weight. That'll vary a little bit. And one thing we always say when we're working with our clients is that we don't like to actually count calories or even macronutrients for that matter. Instead, we really like to focus on educating our clients on how different foods affect their body, what are the appropriate foods to be consuming if nutritional ketosis is your goal, and then how to go about creating an appropriate plate full of ketogenic appropriate foods. So instead of expecting individuals to track everything and weigh everything, which can be really kind of burdensome and time consuming, we try to give them those tools that they can make those decisions without feeling kind of strapped down to an app or a food diary or something of that nature. So kind of give them a little bit of food freedom in that sense. And so what is nutritional ketosis? So this is a completely natural metabolic state where your body is fueled by fats and ketones instead of carbohydrates. And so this really does only occur when you're restricting your carbs to that approximately 30 to 50 gram range. And so you can measure your ketones in urine, breath, and blood. The preferred method for at least our group is with blood. So I've got a little picture of what a meter looks like there in the corner, which you can purchase one of these off of Amazon for about 20 to 40 bucks. And it just requires a very, very small drop of blood, and it gives you your ketone reading in about 10 seconds. So it's pretty much immediate feedback in terms of how you're doing in terms of your nutritional approach if keto is your goal. And so for most people that are consuming carbohydrates on a regular basis, you're not going to see ketones above 0.1 or 0.2. And what we consider a state of nutritional ketosis is a ketone reading somewhere between 0.5 and about 2 to 3 millimolar. And if you are seeing numbers more in that 3 to 5 range, maybe you're kind of an extreme athlete, or you're taking exogenous ketones, which is a whole nother topic in and of itself. You might see that 3 to 5 millimolar range. And then you're not really getting to levels of, above 5 unless you are fasting for several days or you're really, really restricting calories, which is not something that we recommend at all. And I do want to note that nutritional ketosis and ketoacidosis are two completely different metabolic conditions. So again, nutritional ketosis is natural and it's safe. Individuals that have type 1 diabetes or they don't have a functioning pancreas, they do have the concern of ketoacidosis, but for most people, nutritional ketosis is not a concern or shouldn't be a concern because nutritionally you can't reach levels of ketoacidosis. And so kind of moving on to the basics of what a low carbohydrate approach is. So there's not really a strict definition here. It's a lot more broad in terms of the amount of nutrition patterns that kind of fall under this umbrella. So, Mediterranean, paleo, Atkins, even vegetarian, and some probably plant-based approaches can fall under this umbrella of low carb, so to speak. Generally speaking, we would say that the range of 75 to 150 grams of carbohydrates a day is considered low carb. So kind of for a reference point, if you're following the USDA dietary guidelines, which recommends 45 to 65% of your calories coming from carbohydrates, that you would be consuming 200 to 300 grams of carbohydrates, at least if you're following that guideline. So being somewhere in that range of 75 to 150 is a significant decrease in comparison. And then protein will vary kind of based on whichever pattern you are following. So paleo and Atkins tend to be a little bit higher in protein, especially compared to Mediterranean or more of those plant-based approaches. But in general, a low carbohydrate does allow for a little bit more flexibility and just you have a little bit more variety because you are consuming more carbohydrates. I'm seeing a couple questions come in here, so maybe I'll save those for the end because I'll save those for the end right now. And so a lot of people want to know what's better, keto or low carb, kind of pin the two against each other. And so I made a little Venn diagram here. But in general, if you are restricting your carbohydrates, there's benefits to both of these approaches. So, if you are cutting back on those carbs, you're probably removing a lot of those processed foods, added sugars. So in most cases, you'll see improvements in your blood sugar. You'll be experiencing more stable energy throughout the day, and it might help facilitate some weight loss. So fattier foods are a lot more satiating than carb foods. So just kind of in general, by replacing some of those carb-based foods with fat, you'll feel full longer. And so you won't feel that urge to eat outside of meals quite as much as maybe you had previously. And then in terms of benefits for keto specifically, there is a lot of research out there on keto. And, like I mentioned before, you can actually check to make sure somebody is in nutritional ketosis, so it's validated. These individuals often experience improvements in their cholesterol, their HDL cholesterol, which is that good cholesterol, as well as decreases in triglycerides and inflammation, and also therapeutic effects. So I mentioned seizures before, and also individuals with diabetes. And that's not to say that if you're following a low carbohydrate approach that you won't see improvements in your HDL cholesterol and triglycerides, but you're not going to see those therapeutic effects that you do to the extent if you are in nutritional ketosis. But overall, low carb is more flexible, it's less restrictive, and you can implement more variety within that dietary approach. And so kind of like all things in life, there is no one size fits all plan when it comes to nutrition, especially in terms of keto and low carb. And like I said before, I'm not here to say one is better than the other. And I'm not even here to say that low carb is better than a low fat approach to eating. I'm just wanting to give you all some information on this approach because there's definitely a lot of increased interest on this topic. And so when you're trying to determine what your macronutrient distribution should be, it really should be based on what your personal preferences are, whether there are cultural or religious influences that are impacting this, what your overall food preferences are. Do you eat animal products? Do you like fatty foods? Do you care if you have fruit on a regular basis? Things of that nature. And then, of course, what your overall health goals are. All of those factors should kind of contribute to how you decide what your macronutrient distribution should be. And this is a really good place where a registered dietitian can come in handy because we're experienced with these different dietary patterns and approaches and can help you kind of decide what would be the best distribution for you. And if you are wanting to do keto and low carb specifically, I'd recommend finding a dietitian that's well versed in this topic, because at least from the schooling that I had, we didn't learn very much about keto at all. It's not something that's typically taught. So it's important to find somebody that does have a background in that. And on the other hand, if you want to do plant-based or vegan, finding a dietitian that also specializes in that. So it's just important finding a practitioner that can help you with what you're looking for specifically. And so in general, when we are working with clients or we're creating a 7-day menu for one of our research studies, we really do focus on what we call a whole foods-based approach to eating. And this is really how we ensure that we're creating well-formulated, ketogenic, and low carbohydrate dietary patterns. I think we've kind of gotten away from eating real whole foods, and there's been more of an emphasis or focus on a lot of those processed and convenience foods. And so I just think it's kind of important to get back to eating real natural foods. So mostly focusing on plant and animal foods that are either unprocessed or minimally processed. And so what does this look like exactly? So it's going to be rich in fruits and vegetables, of course. The more variety, the more color, the better. Nuts and seeds. And if you're kind of more in that low carb realm, legumes, beans, and whole grains may be appropriate. If you are eating animal products, some dairy products, but you'd be focusing on whole fat dairy products here. So whole fat yogurt, cheese, cottage cheese, also meat, poultry, eggs, and seafood, as well as some minimally processed foods as well. So think of like the frozen fruits and veggies, canned fruits and veggies, canned meats like salmon and sardines and things of that nature, and olive oil and avocado oil. And then it is going to be limited in those ready to eat or convenience type foods. So deli meat, chips, crackers, those ultra processed foods or those refined carbohydrates like soda and white bread and white pasta. And then of course added sugars. And one area of the grocery store that I have found to be notorious for having added sugars is the condiment aisle and that sauce aisle. So there's a lot of sugar in your salad dressings and your barbecue sauce and even your tomato sauce. However, this whole low carb movement has really forced the food industry to come out with better quality products. So not only are there condiments that are sugar-free on the grocery store shelves now, they're also replacing the low quality, highly processed seed oils and those products like soybean oil with high quality fats like olive oil and avocado oil, which has been really exciting to see just kind of that transition happen and occur. And then I've also noticed in the frozen food section that there's a lot more variety in terms of just those non-starchy vegetables. So there's about 100 different versions of cauliflower in the freezer section, ranging from riced to mashed to like tater tot versions, which is kind of cool to see. But in the same tune, there are also some not so great low carb products out there. I think this your nutrition approach should always be kind of an 80-20, 90-10 sort of situation where 80 to 90% of the time you're focusing on those whole food based products. And then maybe 10 to 20% of the time you do have some of those maybe more processed type foods. So I don't know if you've looked around the grocery store much at all, but there are a lot of low net carb foods like tortillas, snack foods like breads and crackers and dessert type foods. And I would just say to have a little bit of caution around foods like that because there's a lot of added fiber to them and sugar alcohols, which can cause some GI distress. Not so fun. And for some individuals, it still will increase your blood sugar. So I had tried one of those low carb tortillas a while back, and I checked my glucose afterwards, and it still increased my glucose over 120 milligrams per deciliter. So that was a lot more than what I expected. And so I can go ahead and define net carbs right now. Somebody's asking. Essentially, net carbs are, so you look at the total amount of carbs in an item and you subtract the amount of fiber from that, and also sugar alcohols too. And that technically gives you what your net carb amount is. And that's kind of the idea behind that whole system. And it's not really a perfect system. So we don't really focus on net carbs when we are working with individuals because it can be kind of confusing and can get complicated, especially if you're using some of those processed foods that claim to have low net carbs. And we can get into that a little bit more if you guys want a little more clarification on that. And so I'm definitely a really visual person. And so I want to give you guys a few examples of how you can go about putting some meals together and what these meals can look like. So I've got a breakfast example and a lunch example and then a dinner example. And in general, these are just really basic meals, no crazy ingredients being used here. I think if you go on to some of these low carb blogs or some of these cookbooks, you'll see that there's a lot of obscure low carb ingredients out there like xanthan gum and all sorts of these nuts and seed flours that can be incorporated. And that's totally fine. You can utilize those ingredients, but it's not essential in terms of you being successful implementing a keto or low carbohydrate approach to eating. And so in general, when we're looking at a plate, we want to make sure that at least 50 to 75% of that plate is coming from vegetables or plant-based sources to make sure you're getting enough nutrients and vitamins and minerals to really have a well-rounded diet in general. And so we do have two non-negotiables that we talk about when we are creating a meal, and that's protein and at least one non-starchy vegetable. So when you are creating a meal, we want to make sure that there's at least protein, a source of protein, and one serving of non-starchy vegetables. So you'll see that's consistent throughout the meals that I'm showing you. And so for this example, you can turn this meal into like a veggie scramble or an omelet or a frittata. But for the keto individual, they've got eggs, a handful of spinach, a serving of broccoli, and half of an avocado. And then to up that protein just a little bit, you can do like a collagen powder or protein powder latte with a little bit of heavy cream. And then for the low carb individual, you can make that omelet or scramble with spinach, tomatoes, and just a quarter of an avocado because you don't need quite as much fat. And then you can do a little fruit parfait with some whole milk yogurt, half a cup of berries, and some granola. And so lunch, bear with me, my Google images can only do so much here. But again, you've got those two non-negotiables, the protein source and the salad or the leafy greens. And then basically what you're topping that meal with is going to be dependent on the amount of carbs that you want to consume. So for the keto individual, cucumbers, cheese, nuts, or seeds, and that olive oil-based vinaigrette. And then for the low carb individual, maybe some chickpeas, carrots, and again, that vinaigrette. And then last but not least, we've got a dinner example here. So you can use your choice of protein, whether it's salmon, tofu, steak, something like that. And then you've got green beans. And then for the keto individual, another serving of non-starchy vegetables. So some sauteed peppers and zucchini. And then for the low carb individual, though you can add in a starchy vegetable like sweet potatoes or some sort of squash, something of that nature. And so again, these are really simple meals that you can put together. They don't need to be complicated recipes, and it can be really utilized for a family unit as a whole. So if you've got kids that are eating more carbs, which is totally normal, you can still have the same protein source and non-starchy veggie. It's just those other sides that you make up dairy just to kind of make that meal complete. And so then this is just kind of a breakdown of what those meals look like in total. So for the day, it's about 1,500 calories, 90 to 95 grams of protein for both of those options. So for some individuals, you might need to add in a snack or another meal, or just make those meals a little bit bigger to make sure you're getting enough calories. But you can see how the fat and carb grams vary between the two diets, but you're still getting about the same amount of food for each of those approaches. And so I kind of had to fly through that. There's definitely a lot more to, especially a ketogenic approach to eating. There's a lot more nuances that do need to be discussed to make sure you are getting all the micronutrients and minerals that you need to be successful and to avoid the keto flu and things like that. So if you are ever interested in meeting with a dietitian specifically on this, we do offer one-on-one nutrition counseling. And in our group, it's myself and another dietitian that have been doing that. So feel free to reach out to us whenever, if you are ever interested in nutrition counseling specifically on keto or low carb. So that's the end of the presentation. I can kind of start answering some of these questions, or if you guys want to